Hello everybody, and welcome to this video, which is kindly sponsored by Squarespace. Today we're going to show two quick edits. So firstly, the meeting drag page, because the trip to Japan in October is definitely confirmed, but this is a coded table, but you'll notice if you just click on it, you can actually open the code up live for editing. So I want to center justify the text. Then I, of course, remember that the coding is all done in American English, because you see I put center spelt R-E and it didn't work. Switch around to E-R, and presto, everything is now center justified. So that's one easy edit. And then if I go over to my recommended website section, I've got everything center justified here, but with links, I don't think that actually really works. So instead, I'm just going to go and tell it to left justify all the text and put it in bullet points. I think that looks a little bit neater for a list of websites, to be honest. All the links are all in basically a column. And then I'm also going to put in a couple of new websites, armoredcarriers.com, which is run by Jamie Seidel, and he has done pretty much the most comprehensive source you're going to find online on British armoured carriers, although again, as you can see, he doesn't like the British spelling of armoured, but yeah, I can take that or leave it. And then, of course, usni.org, plenty of good stuff to find there, including my new book. And that's all the edits done. So if after all these little mini tutorials I've been doing, you think you could build a website for maybe ideally naval history purposes, but you never know, you might want to do it for some other reason, then head over to squarespace.com/Drakenfell. You can get a free trial, and once you're ready, that little link will give you 10% off your first website or domain. So thanks once again to Squarespace for sponsoring the video, and on with the main show. By the end of 1944 and the start of 1945, one could say the Second World War was going somewhat less than optimally for Germany. But the U-boat arm hadn't given up the fight just yet. Their continuing struggle took on two primary forms: a conventional submarine war against Allied shipping that was still ongoing, with attempts to bring large numbers of the new electroboats into service. The other arm, however, involved ongoing attempts to transport low-volume but high-value cargoes to and from the other Axis holdout, that being Japan. Both nations had access to certain raw materials that were vital to the other's war economy, and a number of these materials could be usefully transported in the relatively limited cargo space of a submarine. Various metals that were used to alloy with steel to improve the performance of the resulting steel, for instance, raw rubber, and other things like this, plus other items like medical supplies. On top of that were plans, drawings, and even physical examples of specific technologies which could then be replicated. Both Axis powers still hoped that some combination of these things might provide some sort of wonder weapon which could at least stem the Allied tide, if not reverse it entirely. In Germany, at least, there also seems to have been some thought put into testing just how far and how reliably submarines could sneak away from the main battle zones. You know, just in case evacuating a few key people to remote areas of the world was needed. The people ordering these tests, of course, considered themselves to be very key people. For these purposes, the Germans had designed and commissioned a number of large, extremely long-range submarines. The plans that had come to fruition were all variants of the Type 9. A handful had actually been built almost entirely as cargo carriers, but more of them that had been constructed followed a similar pattern, but with more armament. In early December 1944, one such vessel, the Type 9 D2 U-boat known as U-864, was at Kiel preparing for her maiden operational voyage. She'd only been declared operational in full just over a month earlier, despite having been formally commissioned about a year earlier, as she'd spent the intervening time doing crew training. Displacing a little over 1,600 tons on the surface, and considerably more than that when fully submerged, her theoretical cruising range of well over 12,000 nautical miles would, in theory, just about be enough to get her to the western edges of Japanese holdings if you went all the way around Africa, as long as she topped up in Norway, or she was extremely efficient in choosing her route. She was on a mission that had been designated Operation Caesar, and was carrying a mix of materials and passengers. Originally, the idea had been purely to carry the crew and the cargo, but a Japanese submarine that was attempting a cargo run to Germany had been sunk earlier in the year, and so some of what had been planned as her return manifest had to be moved over to the U-864. But as it turned out, the cargo, or at least some of it, and the passengers were to a degree related. The guests on board consisted of Toshio Nakai, a civilian scientist, unsurprisingly from Japan, and a world expert on rocket fuel. Tadao Yamato, who knew almost everything there was to know about homing torpedoes and was also Japanese, and a range of Germans, Rolf von Schilgensberg, and Riklef Schomerus, both of whom were jet and rocket aircraft experts from Messerschmitt, and one or two others, and as it would turn out later on, a couple more who would be joining them further along the voyage, although that wasn't planned when she set out. Given their collective expertise, it probably comes as a little surprise that the cargo itself contained plans and parts for the Me-262 jet fighter and the Me-163 rocket fighter, the latter of whose propensity to explode at random and or dissolve its pilot in horrific chemicals probably appealed slightly more to the Japanese forces, who were well into the use of kamikazes at this stage in the conflict, as compared to Luftwaffe pilots who tended to have a slightly stronger survival instinct. There were also plans for various aero engines, the Walter high-test peroxide submarine engine, and various advanced submarine designs, as well as plans for radio equipment, fire control equipment, guns, machinery, acoustic homing devices, cameras, radar, guidance systems for missiles, and 1,857 flasks of mercury, adding up to around 65 tons of the liquid metal, which was directly and indirectly quite useful in a great many war industries. Escorted out of the harbour by surface ships due to steadily building coastal ice levels, the U-boat headed north. 4 days later, she reached Horten in southern Norway. Here, she underwent extensive testing in preparation for her mission. Although fitted with a snorkel system to allow her to recharge batteries without having to surface, it was by no means a perfect technology, with leaks, negative pressure events, and jammed valves not at all uncommon in the U-boat arm. For such a long mission, it was thus imperative that U-864 systems should be tested, retested, and certified with every possible issue resolved. Doubly so as mid to late war German U-boat building was somewhat hampered by resource shortages thanks to the Allied blockade. It was also important to practice diving and surfacing, or for the use of the snorkel, near surfacing, as part of the submarine's ballast had been removed and replaced with the mercury flasks. Thus, the exact mixture of commands and controls that would be needed to manage the sub smoothly at precise depths would need some refinement. It was just as well that all the tests were done, as a fairly large number of problems were identified, particularly with the snorkel. It would not be until December 27th, 1944, that the U-boat was finally cleared to continue her voyage, with one more planned stop before she would go on the long slog to Japanese territory. That stop would be at Kristiansand in order to top up on fuel and food. This relatively short voyage was accomplished in less than a day, and less than 48 hours after that, the sub was back out at sea. But trouble was soon stalking her. Issues with the snorkel system recurred despite all the work in Horten, and U-864 was ordered to pull into the small port of Farsund, which was less than half a day's sailing past Kristiansand. The submarine grounded trying to enter the small fjord, although luckily it hit a sandbank as opposed to a rock, but the snorkel's issues couldn't be fixed by the men available in the tiny port, so she was ordered to sail still further onwards to Bergen, where a much larger submarine base and U-boat pen complex would have far more expertise and far more resources available. As well as the various unplanned stops, the snorkel failure meant that the submarine now needed to run with a surface escort on the surface, sailing again on January 1st, 1945, and arriving at Bergen 4 days later to enter the vast concrete bunker known as Bruno Complex. However, by this point, the British were well aware of the nature of U-864's voyage, and, roughly speaking, where she was. Ultra-decryption at Bletchley Park had known that a number of U-boats were being prepared to transport vital war materials and passengers to Japan, and at this point in the war the concern was more about whether those cargoes might end up making life more difficult for the Allied Pacific offensive than about anything the submarines might bring back with them from Japan. However, U-864's continual problems also meant that the Norwegian resistance network had not only noticed her progress up the Norwegian coast, but they'd gotten a good enough look at her to recognise that she was much larger than the average U-boat, and thus this made her a priority target, as it was very likely that she was one of the cargo subs which Bletchley Park had read about. And so, when she arrived in Bergen, the British knew more than enough about her to place stopping her high on their priority list. For this, they first turned to the RAF, which had conducted a more general heavy bombing of submarine bases as part of the campaign against Germany as a whole, and more recently had been concentrating on the series of bases that could stage subs to and from Japan specifically. But now there was a very specific target in a very specific location, and so numbers 9 and 617 squadrons were called on. These were specialist attack units, the latter famous for the Dambuster raids, and both had recently taken part in the sinking of the battleship Tirpitz using the large supersonic tallboy bombs, for which their Lancasters had been specially fitted. Thus, on the 12th of January, the base at Bergen came alive to the sound of air raid sirens and the thump, thump, thump of anti-aircraft guns as tallboys began raining down all around. Thanks to a mix-up which left the bombers almost entirely without escorts, a nearby Focke-Wulf 190 unit was able to show up partway through the raid. This disrupted the aim of many of the bombers and would force others to abort. 3 or 4 bombers, depending on your source, were shot down, and several others were damaged. In exchange, the world's unluckiest minesweeper, the M1 of just under 700 tons, took a direct hit from a tallboy that punched a hole right through her. Shockingly, she sank almost immediately, with 20 of her crew killed. A merchant ship took a near miss that blew her partially onto land with the force of the explosion, and the bunker that U-864 was hiding in took 3 direct hits. She ended up being extremely lucky, as one of the tallboys smashed down into the roof pretty much right over the top of where she was docked, and heavy chunks of reinforced concrete rained down, heavy and numerous enough to wreck her completely if they hit. But there was a 4-foot-thick partial mezzanine floor in the area that she was in, and that ended up taking the brunt of the explosion and the debris. Some smaller bits of debris and an awful lot of dust bounced over and onto the sub, but the damage would be repairable. On the night of the 3rd through 4th of February, U-864 therefore prepared to set sail once more. Much delayed, most recently by the repairs, but in theory she was now ready for her long voyage around the world. Meanwhile, another, much smaller submarine had sailed less than 48 hours before. This was HMS Venturer, a sub barely 1/3 U-864's displacement and commanded by Lieutenant Jimmy Launders. He'd already managed to sink several German ships and the U-boat U-771, which he'd caught running on the surface while Venturer had been on a mission to resupply the Norwegian resistance. Launders was recognised as something of a rising star in the Royal Navy's submarine service, and although she was small, Venturer was well suited to short-range hunting operations in the North Sea and the areas immediately around it. She was the lead boat of the V-class, a derivative of the small U-class, which themselves had originally been designed for training and coastal operations only, but with the pressures of war had been mass-produced for use in the European theatre. As compared to the U-class, the V-class could dive a bit deeper thanks to a thicker pressure hull, and had a more refined bow and stern shape which allowed for greater speed. This, combined with the U-class's design heritage, which retained some elements of a prospective successor to the World War I R-class hunter-killer submarines, before a switch and partial redesign to a training sub had been made, meant that she was faster than almost any other submarine when travelling underwater during the Second World War, if you assume that the sub in question hadn't been specifically designed for underwater travel, like the Electra boats were. her 10-knot underwater top speed being almost as fast as her otherwise somewhat pedestrian 11 to 12 knots on the surface. She was now on her 11th war patrol and had been directed to engage targets of opportunity, but to keep an eye out for U-boats, specifically, operating near Korsfjorden, just southwest of Bergen. But that would all change shortly after she arrived in the area. Less than a day after U-864 had sailed, Venturer would receive the following signal. Important, secret. U-boats probably using the following routes. From 60 degrees 47 minutes north, 4 degrees 26 minutes east, course 110 degrees, rendezvous off Hellesøy. Probable that U-boats proceed to seaward of the rendezvous point. This was somewhat north of the submarine's current position, as Launders knew that U-boats tended to enter Bergen using the southern channels, but exit from the northern ones, and in his opinion, U-boat crews coming home tended to be somewhat less vigilant than those who were leaving, which made them easier prey. While the orders were couched in a language that suggested a general retasking against U-boats as a whole, that was a security measure, just in case the message was intercepted and decrypted. In fact, the message had been informed by very specific intelligence about the upcoming departure of U-864 and the Admiralty's desire to target and sink it specifically. Venturer thus headed north and arrived in the area first. The day after she began patrolling, she spotted suspicious-looking surface craft, almost certainly the armed trawlers that had escorted U-864 into deep water. But she didn't pick up the sub herself. U-864 was proceeding on her electric motors somewhat behind her escort, and very quietly snuck past the searching British sub, although of course neither was aware of the other's presence. But the next day, as the U-boat prepared to shape a course for the north of the Shetland Islands, one of her diesels began to hiccup and vibrate. Normally, that wouldn't be an issue. Although taking apart the engine to work out what was wrong and then presumably fix it was pretty much impossible while she was at sea, the Type 9D2 had 4 diesels in 2 pairs, and on almost any other voyage, she could complete a mission while just not running the problematic engine. Even in smaller U-boats with just 2 diesels, it hadn't been unheard of to complete a war patrol when one of the engines malfunctioned by just shutting it down. But for such a long voyage, the impact on fuel efficiency, as one set of engines was for full-speed cruising and the other was for more economical cruising, as well as the potential breakdown of further engines during the mission, meant that the U-boat was recalled to Bergen to fix the problem, with an escort promised to meet her off Hellesøy. And thus, at 09:32 on the 9th of February, Venturer was patrolling using the passive setting on her ASDIC system to listen for enemy activity. At that point in time, the operator heard the distinctive noise of a diesel engine, but one that faded soon after it was detected. Possibly, it was a fishing boat moving to new grounds or repositioning itself to gather nets. But it could be a stalking sub-hunter that was listening with its own hydrophones. Or it could be something else. A quick periscope sweep, however, revealed empty seas, and that was suspicious. Just after 10 o'clock, the sound was heard again. The periscope went up, and this time they were indeed fishing boats. Mystery solved. Except they then noticed that the fishing boats were on an entirely different bearing from the engine noises, which were also getting louder and more frequent. The watch now changed, but Venturer had the scent of something, and so she began carefully moving around, using the change of bearing on the ASDIC, as well as brief uses of the periscope, to try and work out what exactly was out there making the noise. And then, at 10:50, something was spotted. 5,000 yards away, a small, thin object poking out of the sea and moving with purpose on the same bearing as the strange engine noises. Although noted in Venturer's log as a periscope, it was in actuality almost certainly the snorkel of U-864. Lieutenant Launders was informed of the discovery, and Venturer, quietly of course, went to action stations. Launders ordered an intercept course while furiously working his mind over the issue. Both submarines were submerged, and there just wasn't a specific attack profile for this scenario. The last time this situation had been seriously considered, that being underwater warfare, was when the R-class submarines had been in service towards the end of and immediately after World War I, and anyone who'd served on them in their active phase, before they were relegated to training craft, was either long retired or a flag officer by now. He had to be very careful. A hasty launch would no doubt be heard by his target, which could then come back and launch a counterstrike on a reciprocal bearing. And Venturer, being a small sub, only carried 8 torpedoes, 4 in the tubes up forward, and a single set of reloads. Both submarines were moving very slowly. U-864 seemed to be charging her batteries while using what energy was left over for propulsion, while Venturer was very slowly running down her own battery levels. Launders ordered his sub to stalk the target on a parallel course to get a better idea of the enemy's course and speed. This was because by sailing alongside the contact and then gradually adjusting his own course and speed so that the ASDIC contact remained on a constant range and bearing, he would discover exactly where and how fast the enemy was going without having to use his own periscope and then try and make estimates based on the tiny metal pole that was sticking above the waves a couple of miles away. This was because, assuming that he matched courses perfectly, his own course and speed would be the same as his target's. Gradually, he manoeuvred Venturer until the range closed around 2,500 yards. But then, at 11:20, the Germans' own hydrophone array must have picked something up, as the U-boat now began to zigzag, the standard anti-submarine defensive maneuver. Her periscope popped up, joining the snorkel, and began swiveling back and forth in an effort to locate her pursuer. By 11:51, Venturer had managed to get the range down to 2,000 yards. Launders was carefully charting each bearing and report, mapping the timing and speed of the zigzags of his target, thus working out where the U-boat would go next. He knew that textbook U-boat operations mandated that, if attacked, the submarine should immediately turn away from whatever its current course was and dive deep, so he resolved to calculate the next turn to port. If he could predict that, then he could have a firing solution ready. At least one of his torpedoes might have to head for where the sub would be if she kept up the port leg of the zigzag, with the depth of course adjusted to strike the enemy's hull, which also meant estimating what size of enemy submarine was out there. That torpedo or torpedoes would do the job if the sub somehow missed the incredibly noisy torpedo launch at close range, or just didn't react quickly enough. But all the other torpedoes should be targeted to where the U-boat should be going. Thus, they would need to be set to run deeper and to starboard. There was also a question of risk versus reward, as the more torpedoes were sent after where the enemy should evade to, if they did so, there was a greater chance of scoring a hit. But if they didn't evade, and no torpedo was sent down the actual line of advance, then Venturer would look very foolish, probably be counterattacked, and in any case would need to make a run for it ASAP. Of course, all of that would then need to be reversed if the firing solution was only ready when the submarine had completed a portside zigzag and made a starboard turn. At 12:10, U-864 changed course to port. Launders ordered all 4 torpedoes to be made ready to fire on where he thought the submarine would try to evade to. Each torpedo would be fired on the same bearing at 17.5-second intervals at a running depth of between 30 feet for the first torpedo and 36 feet for the last. The idea being that if the first one arrived slightly early, the next torpedo would arrive on time and on target, and so on and so forth down the line. If, of course, they were really, really lucky, they might land multiple hits along the enemy submarine as it passed through their aim point. And so, at 12 minutes past 12, he ordered the first torpedo away. Aboard U-864, the noise of the torpedo launches was heard loud and clear, with only a couple of minutes before they arrived. The U-boat then executed a textbook evasive turn and dive, just as Launders had anticipated, albeit the big sub came about just a fraction slower than he'd calculated. The last moments aboard U-864 can only be imagined. The submarine would just about have come to its new course and heading when the hydrophone operator would have heard the whoosh and whine of the first torpedo sweep past just ahead of their bow. The big sub's inertia at that point would have meant there was precious little time to react or take any further evasive action as the next two torpedoes raced past, closer and closer still, before the fourth and final torpedo slammed into the submarine just after the conning tower, while the other three raced on to blow chunks out of a nearby island. The strike on U-864 was loud enough and close enough for the men on Venturer to hear it through the hull. The U-boat was blown into three parts. The middle portion, mostly turned into metal confetti, sank quickly. What was left of it slammed into the seabed almost 500 feet below. The bow and the stern, evidently with some air remaining in them, indicating that the bulkheads had in fact been sealed in the moments before impact, drifted downwards more slowly. Although the sheer violence of the big torpedo explosion had most likely, mercifully, killed everyone on board U-864 pretty much instantly. Venturer then spent the next 20 minutes analysing what wreckage had floated to the surface with her periscope before heading off for her original hunting ground down south, just in case anyone came looking for their erstwhile target, which Launders knew was possible since, of course, the sub had been heading towards Bergen, and so would have been expected. It was to be the first, and thus far, as much as anybody knows officially, only submarine versus submarine kill when both vessels were submerged. Venturer would go on to claim 2 more German ships before the war's end, and then, in an ironic twist, she'd be sold to the Royal Norwegian Navy in 1946, serving until 1964 in exactly the same waters that she'd stalked during World War II. Lieutenant Launders received a Distinguished Service Order for his actions, but that ended up being a bar applied to his existing Distinguished Service Order, which it turned out he'd been awarded for sinking U-771 3 months earlier. He would go on to command post-war submarines, including the Amphion class. Then he would command a whole submarine squadron, as well as being head of various training regiments, amongst other things. He was also commander of Rosyth Dockyard, and was eventually made the naval aide-de-camp to the Queen before he retired in 1974 with the rank of captain. In April 1944, another, larger U-boat, the Type 10B U-234, would try a similar run with a similar cargo and passenger manifest, although this time, instead of mercury, she was carrying about half a ton of U-235 in the form of uranium oxide. She would surrender to US destroyers off the Grand Banks about a week after Germany's official surrender, and the nature and fate of her cargo was immediately classified until after the end of the Cold War. More than half a century later, the wreck of U-864 was discovered in 2003 by the Royal Norwegian Navy, after reports of extremely high concentrations of mercury in local sea life. An initial plan to salvage the wreck was cancelled when it was found that many of the mercury containers, which had originally been 5 millimeters thick, were still intact, but they were more rust than steel, with less than a millimeter thickness remaining to them, and thus they would probably disintegrate if they were significantly disturbed. Since then, opinion over whether to raise the submarine using new technology or just bury it wholesale to prevent further contamination has swung back and forth, with the current idea, as of the time of this video being recorded, being to use modern ROVs to try and recover as many of the accessible mercury flasks as possible, before then burying the rest of the wreck to seal those which cannot be safely retrieved.